So, hello and welcome to Via Primetime. This is Siddharth Varadarajan. And today we will be discussing the emerging situation in West Asia, in the Middle East, following Israel's air attack on an Iranian consulate in Damascus on April the 1st that killed several Iranian citizens, including Brigadier General Mohammad Reza Zahedi, who was an important leader of the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards. Iran has promised retaliation, but so far we haven't seen or heard anything. And joining me to discuss the Israeli attack, Iran's response, and how this is playing out in the region and particularly in Washington, D.C., is Dr. Trita Parsi, who is Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, which is, I would say, one of the better think tanks in Washington, D.C. And I have followed Trita's work on Iran-US relations, and on West Asia for the better part of a decade and a half or 2 decades. So it's a great pleasure, Trita, to have you on our show and to have you meet our audience. So welcome to The Wire.
Pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, you wrote an interesting, lengthy social media post the other day where you speculated about how Iran may be playing the hand it has following Israel's attack on its consulate. Iran, as you know, and as our audience knows, has vowed to retaliate. And the question is, in what shape or form will it choose to strike Israel? And you said that one possibility could be that Iran actually may try to, or is already leveraging or parlaying its threat to attack Israel into some kind of a message to Washington that, look, if the Biden administration is serious about delivering and enforcing a ceasefire and getting Israel to call off its attack on the Palestinians in Gaza, then Israel will not perhaps think about attacking Israel the way it's been threatening to do so. In other words, telling Washington, look, you go for a ceasefire, and for us that would be an acceptable outcome, and we wouldn't then look to hit Israel because the entire standoff between Israel and Iran today, in the Iranian official view, is driven by Israel's attack on the Palestinians in Gaza. So tell us a little bit about this proposal. Is it pie in the sky? Is it something real? Have the Iranians actually sent this kind of message, and how is it playing out in DC?
Thank you again. Thank you so much for having me. This is based on a report in the Arab media that is not yet confirmed. The U.S. side has denied it, but given the many things the U.S. side has said on these things, I'm not 100% sure if I would take full stock in what the Biden administration is saying about this at this point. But the bottom line is that there's a report out there saying that as part of the communication that we do know has taken place between Iran and the United States since the attack against the consulate, but also before, the Iranians have conveyed an offer, which is essentially an exit ramp for both the US and Iran, in which they have supposedly conveyed the option of refraining from retaliating against the Israelis, at least in a very harsh way, if the Biden administration secures a ceasefire, which means that Biden would have to get serious about pressuring Israel into a ceasefire, which is something we have not seen so far. And that also potentially could lead to a wider opening between the US and Iran. I think whether that report is entirely true or not, we do know that the Iranians are trying to calibrate how can they retaliate against the Israelis for what they did, which was a violation of a major red line, this attack. I mean, we should be assessing the gravity of this, of bombing another country's consulate. This is a flagrant violation of the Vienna Convention. Now, of course, the Israelis in the last couple of months have been on a streak of violating almost every law of war that exists. But this is a particularly a noteworthy one. And as a result, some form of response by the Iranians seems more or less inevitable, and that's also what they're saying. But it is a very dangerous approach for them because They do not want an open confrontation with the US or with Israel. They prefer a lower level asymmetric confrontation. And at the same time, they're in the midst of a process of seeking to improve relations with their Arab neighbors. You see the normalization between Iran and Saudi Arabia through the Chinese. There's a new modus vivendi between the US and the UAE. We're also seeing how the Iranians are trying to normalize relations with Egypt, for instance. In the midst of all of this, it actually means that Iran's options for striking Israeli embassies or consulates are far fewer than they would have been if Iran was more isolated, because Iran actually has something to lose in this current situation.
I mean, essentially, if it were thinking in terms of strict reciprocal attacks on an Israeli diplomatic facility, then what you're saying is that within the sort of region, Iranian region, or within striking distance of Iranian missiles and aircraft, there aren't any easy targets in terms of managing the consequences as far as Iran's bilateral relationship with the host country is concerned, right?
That's absolutely. I mean, what we see, for instance, if we take a look at what is happening in the Caucasus, after the Azeris took Nagorno-Karabakh, there's been, of course, rising tensions. The Iranians have been on the losing end of that, not as much as the Armenians, of course, but nevertheless, and they're trying to find some way to pacify their tensions with Azerbaijan. If they were to strike the Israeli embassy or a consulate in Baku, that would, of course, destroy all their previous efforts to try to temper those relations, those tensions. Same thing is true if they were to strike Jordan, or if they were to strike Bahrain, for instance. If they were to strike Bahrain, although their relations with Bahrain is in no way, shape, or form particularly good, it could have an impact on the Saudi-Iranian normalization. And that is something that actually has been quite successful. Despite all of the developments in the region, that thing stands. And that, frankly, has been far more successful than the Abraham Accord that the Trump administration put into place and that the Biden administration has tried to build on. So all of these things have actually tied down Iran in a way in which its options are fewer, which then raises the question, would they, as a result, instead try to strike Israel proper? Which would be proportionate from one standpoint, because the Iranian consulate in Damascus is also technically Iranian territory. But it raises some very, very significant dangers, which is the Iranians have very little experience with the Israeli air defense. How would they manage to make sure that they would send in enough ballistic missiles to make through the air defenses and strike a target, but not so many that it actually would end up becoming a disproportionate attack and give Netanyahu a pretext to expand the war, but also avoid the very embarrassing situation in which all of them are shot down and Iran has not only lost face, but also further lost deterrence. It's a very tricky situation the Iranians find themselves in.
After the US assassination of Soleimani, the Iranians did find a way of militarily retaliating by hitting an American target in Iraq. And of course, there weren't any Americans who were killed, and somehow that conflict kind of petered out. There was no further escalation. In the case of any prospective Iranian attack on Israel proper, in fact, I would say even on an Iranian diplomatic mission, if one's assumption is correct and that what Netanyahu is actually trying to do is to provoke a fight with Tehran. Look, from his point of view, he has painted himself into a corner as far as world public opinion is concerned. He's been having this horribly one-sided attack, a genocidal attack on the Palestinian people in Gaza. And what better way to once again burnish Israel's credentials in the eyes of people around the world than to have a somewhat more equal fight, as it were. And so it's always seemed to me that one viable option for the Israeli side has been to somehow provoke the Iranians into striking Israel. So far, the Houthi proxy and the Hezbollah proxy hasn't quite done it. And perhaps what Netanyahu wants more than anything else, actually, is for Iran to lash out. And as you say, the military consequences, Iran's ability to actually inflict any kind of military damage on Israel is it's uncharted territory.
Absolutely.
And instead we know that Israel is the master of disproportionate response. In fact, Israel sees a disproportionate response as a way of actually, I mean, Netanyahu burnishes his own domestic credentials, and this is also an excellent way to keep the debate in the US and West Europe kind of on track, right? Right now, there's a lot of disquiet about what he's doing to the Palestinians. If you have a wider war, that changes the terms of the debate completely. But that doesn't put the Iranian leadership in a very happy position, since they have said publicly that they want to do something, that they're going to hit back, right?
Yeah. Now, you put your finger on something very important. In the case of Soleimani, there were back-channel communications between the US and Iran, and it was very clear. Trump wanted to do something big, but he wanted it to stop right there. He did not want a larger war, nor did the Iranians, but they also had to do something to retaliate, to show that this did not go unanswered. So They did the strike from Iranian territory, not through proxies, took full responsibility for it, wanted to show that it was done by themselves as a way of asserting a degree of deterrence and retaliation. But it was done knowing quite well that it was risky. It could lead to a bigger war, particularly if Americans had ended up being killed. But the other side was not eager to make it a larger war. In this scenario, for the reasons you mentioned, I will add a few more, we're in a very different situation. The Israelis and Netanyahu in particular, do want a larger war. According to the US side, they actually wanted to attack Lebanon immediately after October 7th. And the Biden administration says that they stopped that. Whether that's entirely true or not, I'm not sure. But the fact that the Israelis wanted to go into Lebanon, I have very little doubt about it. If you just took a look at the debate in Israel at the time, and the argument prevails to this day, which is Hezbollah is much more dangerous than Hamas. And if it turned out that Israel could not live next to Hamas, that the big mistake of October 7th was that they actually assumed that they could live next to Hamas, rather than recognizing that, of course, if you are occupying other people for 70 years, you're not going to have peace. But nevertheless, their conclusion was that they made a mistake thinking that they had enough deterrence against Hamas, and that was the mistake. Well, that's even more dangerous if you make that calculation with Hezbollah, since Hezbollah is so much more powerful. And as a result, the conclusion on the Israeli side was it is intolerable to live with Hezbollah next to the Israeli border. And as a result, an attack on Lebanon is necessary to degrade Hezbollah, or at a minimum, push it back to the Litani River. Now, I'll add another factor. I think this, frankly, unfortunately, even more important. Netanyahu knows very well that if this conflict ends, it's not just the end of his political career, it's the beginning of his prison term, because of the criminal charges that exist against him. He is an immensely unpopular prime minister at this point. The chances of him winning re-election is next to zero. His only way of staying in power and hoping that time brings about some form of unpredictable change that saves him from prison is to not only continue the war, but also to enlarge the war. This also incidentally means that he does not have a priority to win the release of the Israeli hostages. And this is one of the big miscalculations of the Biden administration. They hitched their strategy entirely to what Netanyahu decided, assuming, quite erroneously, that he had the same interest as they did, that he wanted to get the hostages out quickly, and that he didn't want to have a larger war. Those are the American interests. Those are not Netanyahu's interests. And now, by expanding the war into Iran, with Iran, Netanyahu would achieve another thing. Just as much as Biden, for political reasons, thought that he needed to bear hug Netanyahu on October 8th. And that bear hug, I think, was the original sin, because Biden essentially gave up all American leverage. Netanyahu may very well calculate that a war with Iran, precisely because of the power of Iran, would force Biden into yet another bear hug and another abdication of American foreign policy to Netanyahu. And then take in the context the last 20 years, in which Netanyahu has pressed every single American president to go to war with Iran. He opposed the JCPOA. He wanted to see a confrontation. And his best shot yet at getting the Americans to cave to his demand for a war with Iran may actually be the one that we're looking at right now.
which is why Iran's hand is actually rather limited, isn't it? I mean, their sort of options are not great, and the kind of off-ramp suggestion which has been floated, even if this has been denied by the US, and let's assume for a minute that there is no deal in the offing, but you are sitting in DC, you have a bird's eye view on the emerging situation on Capitol Hill among various US interest groups. I've seen some forward movement. I mean, there was the pretty blunt statement by Elizabeth Warren declaring what Israel is doing as genocide, something we haven't heard very explicitly in the past. And, there are others who are saying the same thing. Do you feel that the terrain in DC has moved and moved decisively, and that the US may finally, for reasons other than the Iran-Israel issue, also be very eager to clinch a ceasefire? I mean, we are looking at a situation where famine is imminent, and the kind of disaster that this is going to create would be something which US would end up paying a very heavy price, at least in reputational terms, if not on the ground.
The terrain in Washington has certainly changed. In fact, it has changed in very profound ways. I would say in ways that will affect US-Israel relations for generations to come. Biden has not changed, despite this massive change in the terrain. I mean, we're having members of Congress, Elizabeth Warren being the latest one, coming out and saying that this is a genocide. We have very serious efforts right now in Congress to stop arms sales to Israel, things that in the past were completely unthinkable. Even talking about it was unthinkable. So these things have happened, and I'll be frank, many of us predicted that this is the path that would happen, that we would first see a change in Congress because other members of Congress would start to realize Biden's complete deference to Israel is now starting to have a political cost, not just on Biden's re-election bid, but on the re-election bid of these members of Congress. And they are starting to depart from him, not just because it's the right thing to do, although I'm not necessarily sure that is always the primary motivation, but because it's actually costing them politically immensely. Hardly any member of Congress can give a speech these days about this issue or any other issue without being facing young people in the audience, accusing them of facilitating a genocide. And many members of Congress that earlier on were hesitant to call for a ceasefire are doing so very, very vocally right now and breaking with the president on this matter, which is, again, partly because they recognize how costly it is for them. The fact that Biden is not recognizing how costly it is for him is not something that is going to force them to go along with Biden's path here. I would point another thing that I thought was very interesting recently. Senator Chris Murphy, who is a very strong ally of President Biden, in an interview made it very clear that he disagrees with the way the Biden administration is pursuing the negotiations about a ceasefire. Because the Biden administration, again, has completely abdicated its position to be decided by Netanyahu instead. And Netanyahu's approach has been, there will be no ceasefire unless there is a release of all the hostages. There's a linkage between hostage release and the ceasefire, which, of course, under perhaps more normal circumstances and on the face of it, perhaps sounds as if it makes sense. What Hamas did is completely wrong. Taking those hostages is completely wrong. But linking it also then means that as long as the hostages are not released, Israel is justified killing 32,000 innocent people. And this goes back to the UN resolution that the United States introduced that was vetoed by Russia, China, and voted against by several countries, including Algeria. That too linked the release of the hostages to the ceasefire. That was rejected by the other states in the council. And when they introduced their resolution 3 days later, the US had tried to change the text to make sure that there's a linkage. They rejected that. And instead, the resolution came out saying there has to be an immediate ceasefire. The Security Council demands it. And there has to also be an immediate release of the hostages. Two independent imperatives. Both of them are important, but they're not tied to each other, because otherwise you can justify the slaughter in Gaza by saying that there's no ceasefire. You can justify holding the hostages because there's no ceasefire. That's a very dangerous situation, and it's part of the reason why the negotiations has failed. Seeing Chris Murphy going out there and very gently stating that he disagrees with the Biden administration's approach and that there should be a ceasefire regardless of what of the developments on the hostage situation, was quite an important moment. He, of course, wants the hostages released. All of us do, but not in a way that the rest of the population of Gaza, completely innocent civilians, have to die just because the negotiations have not succeeded in a formula that ties the two things together. And again, keep in mind, having a prime minister in Israel who actually doesn't want to get the hostages back. He's been attacked several times and criticized in Israel for not prioritizing the hostage release. That's the prison that Biden has accepted by deferring to Israel and by doing that bear hug with Israel.
Right. 33,000 civilians or Palestinians dead, and the Gaza Strip on the verge of famine. That's the situation today. Trita Parsi, you've said the terrain in DC has shifted dramatically, but Biden still remains wedded to a position that he took last year and doesn't seem to be moving away from it. Thank you so much for joining us. We're completely out of time. Let's hope that we have another chance to talk soon and under happier circumstances. But thank you once again for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much.